Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Rukhsana Rahman from the Department of Women's Studies, Guwahati University. I will be speaking on gender and political violence, that is module number 1. This module speaks about the different feminist theories and also its relations to the other theories in the international field. This will also give a theoretical understanding to the students about the theories of women in the conflict zone, and also will focus on the gendered nature of conflict. So, we will start with the introduction of sex-gender differences under gender and political violence. The difference between gender and sex is the heart of understanding international politics through a gender lens. While gender is socially constructed roles ascribed to particular body types that varies according to class, caste, age, religion, ethnicity, sex is simply the biological construct of the body determined at birth. Feminism understands that socially constructed gender relations are at the heart of most discriminations, oppressions, and violence in the world today. As Nivedita Menon suggests, feminism is about understanding ways in which men and women are produced and inserted into patriarchies that differ according to time and space. Understanding different identities located hierarchically as dominant or subordinate. Understanding gendering as the process by which proper men and women are produced through rules and regulations we internalize or which are violently enforced. Now let us discuss about mapping gender and violence. Violence, both discursive and physical, seems to be at the heart of much of the recent work within politics and international relations. Terrorism, anti-state rebel movements, insurgencies, religious and ethnic riots, mass rape and genocide are all examples of extreme forms of violence that are being studied extensively and yet under-theorized. In this subunit, we use a gender lens to make sense of political violence in its various manifestations. Gender is an analytical category that helps us understand and deconstruct how actors like victims, perpetrators, planners, and patrons of political violence within the international system are socially constructed as feminine and masculine, and how power is vested in some over others. We also explore the feminist ethics of political violence and the dilemmas about essentializing gender norms. Even as feminist works are committed to recognizing women as perpetrators of violence without condoning the violence itself. The effort here is to engage with the discourse of militarized masculinity as proposed by Cynthia and Lowe, and also to understand its limitations as we think about women as direct participants and beneficiaries of political violence in several contexts. The feminist axiom that personal is political comes to mind while studying cases of political violence that include terrorism, armed insurgencies, and communal riots. It's better to say that that it was a slogan of the second wave feminist movement also, which became popular as personal as political or political as personal. Women are part of political violence landscape in 4 significant ways. These are as victims and survivors, as transnational activities opposed to violence and wars, as perpetrators, planners and patrons, as cultural bearers of ethnic, religious and national identities. Women's bodies and engendered political violence in South Asia. The ordeal of the Pakistani teenager Malala Yousafzai from Swat, who was shot by Taliban militants for advocating education for girls, is a grim reminder of how gender norms are upheld and challenged in militant wars. A 14-year-old school-going girl becomes a threat to a militant group, that is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan ideology, and their masculinity is validated by erasing women out of public spaces, by issuing religious dictates against women, and by bombing and killing girls in schools and women in marketplaces. Militant groups in Afghanistan perpetrate violence and abuse against women with ease, despite government pledges to fight terrorism and extremism. Extremist groups in Pakistan target women and girls, Muslims and non-Muslims indiscriminately. In India, women cadres, who are almost 60% of the fighting force among the Communist Party of India Maoists, are raped and abused by their own comrades. The cycle of violence is continued through the counter-insurgency operations, where the state security forces kill Maoist women and dehumanize them further if they are captured. The rape and torture of women in custody is common, and dehumanizing women who are considered as the other, quote unquote, is the norm. There have been several studies conducted on the issue of the torture and sexual abuse that is carried out on women, although the practice continues unabated. In Sri Lanka, women cadres of the LTTE are abused, raped and marginalized, while the government propaganda machinery talks about its benevolent rehabilitation efforts. In fact, it was only after the United Nations carried out investigations that the true and appalling extent of the abuses that had been carried out came to light. It is therefore significant that large number of women continue to be the soft targets in acts of political violence by state and also by non-state actors, and this factor needs to be interrogated and highlighted constantly in this subunit. A fallout of this violence against women in their absence in formal peace talks and conflict resolution processes. This is based on the widely held belief that men participate in armed resistance and sacrifice their lives and freedom for their ethnic, political or religious group. Women too perform multiple roles in wars and political violence, including as armed guerrilla fighters, militants and support systems. However, their experiences are only documented in public memory as the worst sufferers and victims, quote unquote. Lack of social and political recognition of their participation in armed resistance has resulted in their exclusion from all peace talks. The message from such situations is that stakeholders in peace must have served and sacrificed in the war, and it is usually men who are recognized in their war roles. Increasingly, feminist scholarship and activism has challenged this notion of what women do, quote unquote, in wars, and articulated that women's voices are critical in not just engendering and sustaining a conflict, but also in its resolution. Given below are some indicative figures of the United Nations vis-a-vis women and the impact of conflict on them, and also their presence in the negotiations for peace. Peace negotiations. First, out of 585 peace agreements from the year 1990 to 2010, only 92 continued any references to women. Secondly, between 1992 to 2011, fewer than 4% of signatories to peace agreements and less than 10% of negotiators at peace tables were women. Thirdly, women's participation increases the probability of peace agreements lasting at least 2 years by 20%. It also increases the probability of a peace agreement lasting 15 years by 35%. Now let us discuss about women's leadership. In conflict-affected countries, women's share of seats in parliament is 4% points below the global average of 22%, and women occupy only 14.8% of ministerial positions. The percentage of United Nations field missions headed by women has fluctuated between 15 and 25% since the year 2011. In the summer of 2014, 6 women ambassadors served on the United Nations Security Council, putting women's representation at an unprecedented 40%. Now let us discuss about health, education and livelihood. Approximately half of children of primary school age who are not in school live in conflict-affected areas. Girls whose adjusted net enrollment rate in primary education is only 77.5% in conflict and post-conflict countries are particularly affected. More than half of the world's maternal deaths occur in conflict-affected and fragile states, with the 10 worst performing countries on maternal mortality all either conflict or post-conflict countries. Only 9% of landholders in conflict and post-conflict countries are women, compared to 19% globally. Justice and security. In 2015, 97% of military peacekeepers and 90% of police personnel are men. 40% of convictions of individuals at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia include sexual violence charges. 1 is 4 households of the Syrian refugees families in Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq and Jordan are headed by women. While looking at peace building and recovery, in the context of early recovery programs, only 22% of funds from cash contributions were directly disbursed to women in the year 2013. In the year 2014, women only received 35% of benefits from temporary employment activities from disarmament, demobilization and reintegration programs. In Sierra Leone, a survey asked predominantly male ex-combatants to identify those who played a significant role in helping them reintegrate. 55% named women in the community. Now let us discuss about how feminists have looked into such situations. Feminist response. Feminist discourses in recent times have been increasingly divided over the universal application of human rights, gender equality, and respect for local cultures and traditions. Political violence thrives on ideologies that treat women and girls as second-class citizens and justify violence against them. The way forward is not just in exposing these cultures of violence, but also in formulating feminist responses that offer an empathetic critique of traditions and cultural practices that marginalize women and render them invisible in violent, militant cultures. In this unit, we outline the complex relationship between gender and political violence through concepts such as militarization, masculinity, ethics, representation, etc. It also engages with the ongoing feminist debates and anxieties about ways in which women are embedded within violent conflicts and war. Now let us discuss about gender and conflict. Gender inequality and dominance are intricately interlinked with conflict, whether the conflict is at the local, national or international levels. Deborah and Tenen argue that the reasons for gender differences are more troubling than other cross-cultural differences as they occur where home and hearth are. We enact and create our gender and our inequality with every move that we make, quote unquote. Local, national and international conflicts are interdependent because domestic inequality affects the state's behavior at the international level and in its foreign policy. Domestic equality has a pacifying influence on a state's foreign policy based on the reflection of feminine values in state society. Furthermore, state international behavior may be partly determined by its degree of structural equality, since inequality between men and women serves as a barrier to sustainable peace. Structural equality involves a commitment to freedom and equality and rejects hierarchy, domination and the use of force, which characterizes structural inequality. According to Caprioli, there is less possibility that conflict would be obsolete, but the application of non-violent methods in a state's foreign policy will minimize conflict, which can be possible by gender equality or structural equality. Exclusion of gender as an independent analytical category in policy making is likely to aggravate conflict situation. There has been a common perception that international politics is a man's world, quote unquote. This perception prevails because traditionally men have the prominent and dominant role in the fields of military, diplomacy, foreign policy and interstate relations. Though it is observed that women have an interest in issues such as war and peace, but their frequent dissent from national security policy brands them as naive, uninformed and even unpatriotic. In the year 1985, Donald Reagan claimed that, I quote, "Women are not going to understand missile throw weights or what is happening in Afghanistan or what is happening in human rights. Some women will, but most women would rather read the human interest stuff of what happened, unquote. The creation of social hierarchies and political hierarchies perpetuate women's oppression. According to Valerie Hudson, R. Charlie Carpenter, and Mary Caprioli, the best predictor of state peacefulness is not democracy or wealth, but the level of physical security women enjoy in a given society. In societies where gender roles are more equal, there is lower level of conflict. Now let us discuss about the gender role, which plays a prominent role in minimizing insecurity and also conflict. Caprioli argues that promotion of democracy and human rights alone cannot address violence, health insecurity, and political inequality of women. Studies have claimed that where women are marginalized, there are more chances of terrorists being nurtured by states. Pentagon headquarters of the United States Departments of Defense has also repeatedly emphasized that dropping a bomb is not sufficient for dealing with terrorists. Empowerment of women at the grassroots level through education is crucial for disempowerment of terrorists. This linkage between women and security and conflict is a serious matter in Pakistan and Afghanistan, where women face the most insecurity, and military personnel are seriously looking into the increasing role of women in reducing insecurity and conflict-like situations. It is found that it is important to analyze a couple of perspectives of women in dealing with conflict or conflict-like situations. Number one, psychology of defense. When a particular group, society or country is affected or likely to be affected, all people, both men and women, are ready to fight or support the military in fighting. Both men and women will align in support of military response to protect territory, material resources, and family members. In these streets, men and women work together to defend and protect the resources and values they hold dear and consider vital to their survival and the welfare of the next generation. In such fights, everyone participates, and any benefit that derive from a successful enterprise, such as safety and security, are shared equally by all. Number two, psychology of offense. In the case of offensive situation or campaign, divergence is found between men and women. Young, unmarried and unemployed men are more likely to go for offensive campaigns in order to forcefully acquire resources to gain prestige or status, or increasing and displaying their military power. However, married women who have young sons are less likely to support military campaigns where lives of their sons are at stake. Now let us discuss about United Nations, conflict, and also about gender. Gender is an integral element in the United Nations. Considering the importance of gender, the UN introduced Gender Empowerment Measure (GEM) and Gender Development Index (GDI). GDI was introduced as a gender-sensitive measure of Human Development Index (HDI) by combining into an equally distributed index both male and female longevity, life expectancy at birth, knowledge of adult literacy rate, and combined primary, secondary, and tertiary gross enrollment ratio, and a decent standard of living, GDP per capita in purchasing power parity US dollars. GEM attempts to capture women's political, economic and social participation. Holsti and Rosnow argue that women are more likely than men to give importance to international organizations and economic interdependence, which are beneficial for world peace. Women have a higher tendency than men to agree that the United Nations should help settle international disputes. In the year 1995, the United Nations Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action emphasized the role of gender equality and participation of women in the various decision-making processes. In the year 2000, the Security Council passed Resolution 1325, which urged member states to apply a gender perspective to international peace operations to ensure increased representation of women in all decision-making levels for the prevention, management and resolution of conflict. It also directed the Secretary General to appoint more women as special representatives and envoys and expand the role and contribution of women in United Nations field-based operations and especially among military observers, civilian police, human rights and humanitarian personnel. Similar initiatives throughout the United Nations, the World Bank WB and the International Monetary Fund IMF show the significance of gender in global governance. Here there are some observations. However, according to McDermott, gender inequality and domination affect women in three ways. Number one, physical integrity. Threat to physical integrity is one of the manifestations of masculine domination at the national as well as in the international levels. It includes threat of death in war, female genital mutilation, maternal malnutrition and mortality, and control over population. This might also include issues such as birth control in refugee camps, a current problem in many of the Syrian camps along the Turkish border. Number two, inequitable practices in family law by sex. Inequitable practices of family law most often favor men in the areas of consent to marriage, inheritance, divorce and custody laws and polygamy. Lack of parity in governance. It means women are both consciously and unconsciously excluded from the governance structure. The recognition by international humanitarian, criminal and human rights law of the ways in which women are affected by violence during armed conflict has greatly expanded the normative international framework for their protection. Key among such provisions are the Geneva Conventions and Protocols, General Recommendations number 19 of CEDAW, the first United Nations document to acknowledge that women suffer disproportionately from violence because of discrimination, and bindings SC resolutions, particularly 1820 in 2008, which establishes that rape can be a tactic of war and a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. The spectrum of violence ranges from forms of ill treatment and torture in custody and physical and mental violence in private and the public spheres to economic and social harms facilitated by restrictions on civil and political rights. Thank you.